Hello, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose Live. I'm Beth Wong, and I work in events for Politics and Prose. We thank you so much for joining us in this new format where we're continuing to bring the authors you love and their new books to PNP's community. At any time during the event tonight, you can click on the green button below to purchase tonight's book on PNP's website. We're currently offering free media mail shipping as an incentive, especially as our physical stores are closed, and we need your online purchases in order to keep bringing you the programming that PNP is known for. Tonight, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Ask a Question, found near the bottom of your screen. You can also read other people's questions and even vote for the ones you'd like to hear answer the most in that box as well. A reminder that unlike our in-person events, the author, host, and other audience members cannot see you through the screen. We welcome you in your pajamas, in your anything. Thank you so much for being here. On to the main event. Olga Khazan is an award-winning writer for The Atlantic, whose pieces cover health, gender, and science. She's written for the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and Forbes, among many other publications. Her debut book, Weird, which was just released today, today's her pub date. Everybody wish Olga happy pub date. Is about turning one's own nonconformity into a great and powerful strength. Welcome, Olga.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in. So I'm Olga, and welcome to my book talk. My book is all about the science of nonconformity, and it's all told through the stories of people who are nonconformists of all stripes. So if you've ever felt a little bit different, a little bit unconventional, like your background doesn't quite fit the norm, this is probably the book for you. This is going to tell you what it's all about and how to make the most of that difference that's inside of you. I wrote this book in part because I wanted to explore part of my own unusual origin story. I'm a Russian immigrant who grew up in West Texas. It was as weird as that sounds. I think it's important that I tell you a little bit about how this happened, because that's not something that naturally happens. In the 80s and early 90s, there was a mass exodus of Jews from the USSR. American Jewish groups considered the USSR's atheism a kind of cultural genocide against the Jews. This talk does get more uplifting, I promise. So they lobbied for refugee slots for families like mine, which is really great. We were very lucky to be brought here. So when we were resettled here, they tried to put us near other Jews because they thought it would make us feel more comfortable to be around other people like us. So we initially settled in Los Angeles, which definitely has a lot of Jewish people. But it turns out my parents having trouble making that work financially. It was just way too expensive to live there. So when I was 4, my dad moved my family, me, my mom, and my dad, moved to Midland, Texas, which is perhaps unsurprisingly much cheaper than Los Angeles. If you aren't familiar with West Texas and its environs, the Midland is right near Odessa, Texas, which is where Friday Night Lights is set. So if you've ever seen that, the Clear Eyes, Warm Hearts, or whatever, Can't Lose, that is that is Odessa and Midland, and football is definitely a big part of that. So my dad, when we moved there, he was like, "Don't worry, we'll just be here for a few years so we can save up some money, and then we can move on." But it's now 30 years later, and they still live in Texas. So there, Midland is Midland. There's not a lot of Jews. I think I actually tried to look up to see if they have a synagogue at one point in the research for this book, and they don't, or it's like they did, but it shut down due to lack of interest. So that gives you an idea. Instead, it's heavily evangelical Christian. And when I was in middle school, my family moved to a suburb of Dallas that is also heavily evangelical Christian. I tried going to like a Christian youth group for a while. I didn't really fit in there. I went to a synagogue in Dallas once, but because most Russian Jews are atheists, I didn't really find a home there either. I didn't really know anything about Judaism or being Jewish. In general, I had a lot of trouble kind of connecting with people, finding common interests. I think you might have heard from my riffing on Friday Night Lights earlier that I'm not too familiar with football. I kind of spent a lot of time alone, basically until college. And my family was just so different from everyone around us that it seemed like everything I did got filtered through this lens of being an immigrant. Like that was a huge part of my identity growing up. And until like kind of late into life, like my whole life until college, basically, I was told directly or indirectly that I was weird. And then even later when I was getting into journalism, I noticed that a lot of the elements of my profession had, kind of this code similar to how Texas had a code, except it was one of kind of, growing up in this family that was reading the newspaper together every morning, or, getting the New Yorker, or, kind of other markers of privilege that my family never really had because we weren't from that world. Anyway, so all of this kind of brooding about my identity and my weirdness got me to thinking, why do people consider certain things to be weird? Why do we like to fit in and be just like everyone else around us? Why would it have been so nice and comfy to be an evangelical Christian football lover in Midland, Texas? And why was it so uncomfortable to be not one of those? And why do we have this kind of instinctively kind of negative reaction to people who don't fit in? What is weird anyway? And if you are weird, how can it benefit you? So the first thing I was wondering in the process of reporting this book is, how do we as a society decide certain things are weird? For example, if someone tells you they're polyamorous, that might seem kind of off-putting to a lot of people. But in fact, for a long time, until actually very recently, American society considered even gay marriage to be unnatural. They actually thought that about interracial marriage until shockingly late in history. So why do we think that is like kind of not normal? Why do we have a negative reaction to that? Why do large groups of immigrants unnerve so many people? Why do people kind of get freaked out whenever they see a lot of immigration coming to their area and a lot of people speaking a new language? I wanted to explore kind of, why does our spidey sense go off in those moments? Why do we have a negative kind of visceral reaction to those things? So these things, whether we accept certain types of marriage or certain types of appearances or behaviors, are all norms. Think of it like your office dress code, except there's kind of a more subtle code for everything that you do in life. So your office probably doesn't also have a speech code, but there is probably a certain way that you talk to your coworkers, and it's probably different than how you talk to your friends or your family. So the strictness of these norms, how rigid they are, has to do with a concept in psychology called tightness and looseness. Tight cultures are those in which the social norms are really strict and formal, and the punishments for breaking them are really severe. In tight cultures, people are more in step with one another, but loose cultures permit kind of a wider range of behaviors. So tight cultures, if you think about them, are like things like the military, the Amish. If you watched that show on Netflix recently, Unorthodox, where the woman is living in the Orthodox Jewish community, and there she has rules for how she has to like take a bath, and how she's supposed to like wear her wig, and how she's supposed to make her dinner. That is a very tight culture. It's telling you how to do every single thing in your life according to a certain rule book. So if you think about loose cultures, then you think about tech startups. No rules, no HR department, no dress code, people high-fiving each other, people sitting all in an open office plan. That's something that's going to be a loose culture of a lot of different behaviors that are permitted. At the totally extreme end of this is like Burning Man, where you can show up with whatever kind of art project on your head you want, and it's totally fine. So it's going to be easier to be weird in a loose culture than in a tight one. Now, this idea of tight and loose nations has been around for a little while, but it was really firmed up by the psychologist Michelle Gelfand, who's incredible. And she's done all these studies that show how tightness and looseness affect societies. So in one study, she asked people from 33 countries how much they agree with statements like, in this country, if someone acts in an inappropriate way, others will strongly disapprove. She also asked them how acceptable it would be to say kiss in a public park. In tight societies, that would be inappropriate. So she found some interesting associations between different elements of day-to-day life in these societies, all of which point to their willingness to break social norms. So tight countries are more likely to be autocratic and have a less free media. People in tight countries are more religious, less likely to protest, and less likely to commit crimes. People who are more normatively tight were more likely to vote for President Trump in 2016. Loose countries have more crime, but they're also more tolerant of change or people with facial scars. Essentially, cultures trade orderliness for creativity as they go from tighter to looser. Interestingly, agricultural societies tend to be tight, but hunting and fishing societies tend to be loose. People in tight societies tend to be more cautious and dutiful, and they have a greater need for structure. If you feel like everyone says that you don't fit in, it might be because the culture of your workplace, your city, or your social circle is very tight. Another spidey sense type thing that tells us whether something is weird or not is called the behavioral immune system. Now, most of us have heard of the regular immune system. It keeps us healthy, helps us recover from the cold and flu, and God forbid, the coronavirus. But we also have this thing called the behavioral immune system, and it essentially helps us avoid people who break our social norms because subconsciously we worry that they might be infected with illnesses that we can't fight off. So there are a few ways this works. So first, people who don't follow the local customs might be from faraway lands, we think, internally in our heads, and they might be bringing unfamiliar pathogens that could wipe out your tribe. So you kind of want to avoid people who don't follow the local social norms of your environment. Next, people who break certain social norms, like the ones against having lots of sexual activity, might be more likely to spread diseases, even if they are from your area. So you might want to avoid people who break sexual norms. Finally, if someone has an unusual appearance or behavior, that might mean that they actually have an infectious disease. If you think about like leprosy disfigures the face, so kind of our like internal gut sense is telling us like, oh, avoid that person because they might be sick, right? So this isn't really a rational reaction. This is a gut kind of lizard brain reaction that we have that is telling us to avoid people who are different because we want to stay healthy. So it kind of tells you a little bit about what might be going on now with some of the racist incidents we've seen and coronavirus. Our behavioral immune system is just in overdrive right now, trying to keep us healthy and avoiding anyone who's different from us. This fear of getting sick appears to make us less open to outsiders in several different ways. So when people are more worried about disease, they react more negatively toward foreigners and norm violators. So when you hear immigrants being referred to as like parasites or animals, that's like a really clear indication of the behavioral immune system at work. People in more disease-ridden countries are more likely to be less likely to be extroverted or open to new experiences, which means that they might want to stay away from things that are unfamiliar and avoid exposing themselves to even more sicknesses. Pregnant women in their first trimester are more prone to infections, and during that trimester, they are also more ethnocentric and xenophobic. One study found that states and countries that are more plagued by infectious diseases tend to have stronger family ties and greater levels of religiosity, which the authors interpreted as meaning that they have a preference for sticking with your own kind of people. These studies kind of go on and get crazier and crazier as you read them. People who are more sensitive to the smell of sweat and urine are more likely to support authoritarian political leaders because the thinking is that those leaders would keep out these disease-bearing groups. People who searched for more news about the 2014 Ebola outbreak were more likely to vote Republican, which suggests that they were worried about the virus and wanted someone in office who would have an immigration policy that would keep out these Ebola-infected outsiders. It kind of operates like a strong gag reflex, like it instinctively keeps away someone who might bring something weird to the table, all with the goal of keeping us healthy. So if it ever seems like people have this like instinctive gut level negative reaction to anyone who's different, the behavioral immune system might be why. So for this book, I interviewed 36 people who are different from everyone else in their environment. This might be a male in an overwhelmingly female job, a female in an overwhelmingly male job. One of them was a female NASCAR driver. One of them was a Muslim who grew up in an overwhelmingly Christian town. There were several transgender people living in places where there are not a lot of transgender people. Some of them were heretics in their religions, like an Amish woman who escaped the Amish. They were all kind of fish out of water in different ways. One form of weirdness that has been especially poignant and important to a lot of us in recent years is the weirdness of not relating politically to people who are around you, like in your family or your workplace. So one of the most interesting people that I met who was dealing with this problem is this professor named Beverly. She is a sociology professor who focuses on gender studies and sexual deviance at this university called Midwestern State in what is officially the most Republican place in America, according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index. This index measures how far each congressional district leans to the left or the right. The most Democratic congressional district is the Bronx in New York, and the most Republican is Texas's 13th congressional district. It encompasses this 105,000 person town called Wichita Falls, which is about 2 hours west of Dallas. I went and visited Beverly there one summer. The town itself is pretty much like a small little southern town. It was, I think, May when I visited, and it was blazing lava hot. There was a place called Downtown Pharmacy, a shop called Sam's Dollar Saver. There was one hip coffee shop and a yoga studio that I went to, which was great. It was like your usual, like Taco Bell, stuff like that. I met a few people around the town. They kind of were, people like you would meet anywhere. Maybe slightly conservative leaning. A few of the women that I met told me that, women shouldn't be feminists. A few people said that they weren't very supportive of transgender rights. But in general, I felt like people's, like, at least of who I talked to, political or social issues views were kind of all over the map. Strangely, one guy at Taco Bell told me that he loves my name, and that he knows all about Russian royalty, which was unexpected. So enter Beverly, who is a Democrat and teaches about sexual deviance, something that is often considered pretty strange, even by the most loosey-goosey lefty standards. Her journey into the academy was not that unusual. She grew up in Ohio, and her father mostly raised her, and he was a Democrat, so she kind of started to see politics from his perspective. She eventually, got a job at Midwestern State in Wichita Falls. She, she kind of wanted to broaden her students' horizons and reveal how society shapes our gender norms. She teaches gender. She teaches a lot of different sociology topics. All of them would be kind of in this social issues frame. So for lots of students in Beverly's gender studies class, the existence of gender inequality was an entirely new concept. In the early years, when Beverly would bring up gender norms, some students would respond with teachings from the Bible. They denied that gender inequality existed, and a few would drop the class. Some students believed that feminism was harmful to families. Once in an introductory sociology class, a student yelled out something like, "You're a liberal, aren't you?" Yeah. So in these first few years of teaching the gender class, getting through to the students was pretty hard. She heard from a few of her students that some refused to take her class because she's a feminist. A rumor got started that she's a lesbian, which is maybe because she doesn't wear a lot of makeup. She was kind of struggling to break through to these students, and she just kind of was known as the liberal one, and she felt like some of her teachings were kind of getting dismissed out of hand. So she had to find a way to get her students to be open to her ideas, which at least initially seemed a little weird to them. And what she did reminded me of this old tactic from psychology called idiosyncrasy credits. So I'm going to tell you about idiosyncrasy credits, and they are a really good way. They're something that anyone can use. They're a really good way to get your weird idea past your straight-laced boss, or to get your super traditional friends to be okay with an unconventional bachelorette party idea, or anything weird that you really want to do that's really important to you, you can pretty much try to push it forward through idiosyncrasy credits. Okay, so essentially how this works is if an outsider wants to be accepted by a group without surrendering their individuality, this is a really good way to go. This is like essentially paying homage to the established values of the group and then starting to deviate in small ways. So at first you want to conform and then you want to innovate. So think of these as like little tokens you gather for acting like you belong in the group. So you go to the meeting and you kind of smile along and you like agree with whatever everyone says, and that's a credit. And then you can go to the baby shower and like kind of pretend that you're like really loving it, and that's a credit. And later you can spend those credits by deviating from the group norms. So like later you can go to the meeting and say what you really think, or go to the baby, skip the baby's first birthday party if you really didn't enjoy that baby shower. This is kind of a way of reassuring people that you can be normal in theory before you kind of fully unleash how weird you are. So in the case of like, if you work in an office, maybe you go to a few meetings and act like a total yes man. But let's say you have a passion project that you really want to do, save your big weird ask until after you've established yourself as kind of a conformist. It kind of sucks to pretend that way, but it will help you get that one big weird thing that you want. Another person I was talking to recently compared this to how people think about being in new relationships. So at first, everyone's like, oh, what do you want to do, honey? Like, oh, I'm cool with whatever you want to do. Like, oh, wherever you want to eat is fine with me. But then after like a few months, you're like, we're only eating guacamole and we're only watching the Netflix that I want, because you've already kind of pretended that you're cool with whatever. And now you're going to really let all your distinctiveness shine. So interestingly, this strategy is kind of what the Beatles did. So we think of the Beatles as really clean cut and like these like good guys who like are, just so squeaky clean. But in fact, they were kind of renegades in the 1950s. They would like swear a lot on stage and like yell stuff at the crowd. So their manager, Brian Epstein, kind of wanted to clean up their reputation. And so he set out some ground rules for them. They couldn't drink or swear on stage. They had to wear suits instead of leather jackets. And they had to bow at the end of every song. They had to like comb their hair a certain way, which is like now the infamous Beatles haircut. John Lennon had to avoid mentioning his wife and child, which is like pretty extreme. And so they kind of cleaned up their image. John Lennon described it later as having all the rough edges knocked off of them. But the strategy worked. Bookings picked up, and within months, they had a contract and a hit single, which was Love Me Do. At the height of their fame in 1966, the Beatles started using all these idiosyncrasy credits. They got rid of their polished haircuts. If you remember, they all grew out their hair. They had these unusual solo projects. Their music really changed. 91% of the Beatles' work before 1966 consisted of love songs. Starting with Revolver, just 16% of them did. If you want to listen to an example of someone spending their idiosyncrasy credits, listen to Revolution number 9 on the White Album, which is just the words number 9 over and over again. It's really an example of someone being as weird as possible because they can. So here is how Beverly applied this. Several years ago, she kind of decided to change the way she conducted her class. She started launching each new semester with an introductory lecture into in where she would acknowledge that some students might be alarmed by what she tells them. They might not feel that gender inequality is real, and that's okay. She would tell the students that they're allowed to bring up the Bible, but that she can't personally comment on it. When her students would claim that the study findings don't fit with their personal experiences, she would kind of take the opportunity to talk about the difference between anecdotes and data. Early on, a few men in her class complained that the class devoted too much time to women's issues. So now she spends the entire first half on men and masculinity, and then she kind of moves on into feminism and some of the other more female-centric topics. So she kind of builds these credits by easing her students into the shallow end of sociology and then kind of like leading them further and further in. Many of the students come from blue-collar backgrounds, and so does Beverly. So she shares some details of that with them in order to help build a rapport. And she tries to only stick out in the community in ways that matter to her. She doesn't really get super political with people. She doesn't put like political bumper stickers on her car. She kind of plays it low key in order to try to stay friendly with as many people as possible. And instead of calling her field of study BDSM, she says she researches sexual minorities. And she says things like fixin' two, which is a big Texan thing. She still has students who do things like quote the book of Ephesians to her, which is that one that says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." But she kind of has come to terms with having students who disagree with her a little bit. She kind of thinks it's made her this professor who's willing to make her students a little bit uncomfortable, which is pretty, sometimes rare in academia. Over time, part of it is that her job has become a little bit easier. People have become more woke on gender issues. The majority of her students now know what a glass ceiling refers to, for example. She doesn't hear the rumor that she's a lesbian anymore. But she also kind of sees signs that this idiosyncrasy credit strategy is working and that she herself is making a difference. One student said that she had used her teachings to explain the concept of gender identity to people at her church. One preacher's daughter whispered to Beverly that her class had opened her eyes. She told me about another student who would never consider getting her son a baby doll, but after taking her class, she was at Target or something with her son, and the son asked for a doll, and she was like, of course. So you can see how people are becoming a little bit more open to what she's saying and starting to understand kind of where she's coming from when she's talking about these gender norms. So this is a really kind of extreme example of someone dealing with difference and weirdness and how they use idiosyncrasy credits. But of course, there are a lot of more low stakes ways to apply this in your everyday life. Whenever you feel like you have a really unconventional idea that you want to put out there, this is a way to kind of, give a little bit, seem like a conformist, and then really get that big ask that you want by letting your weirdness fly free. I especially really like this quote that Beverly left me with, which is, "What is becomes what should be." It kind of means that norms can change, even when it seems really hard, even when you're living in one of those really tight environments where it seems like everything is set in stone and you really have no wiggle room. It is still possible to kind of introduce some weirdness and some innovation into that space. And that should give a lot of weirdos a really good reason to hope and to feel like, the world can be weird after all. And now I will take your questions if you have them.
There I am. Thank you so much for that. That was awesome. I'm definitely, I think, going to be using some idiosyncrasy credits in my office. I hope not too many of my coworkers are watching.
Right. Don't tell them about this.
Right, exactly. We have 4 great questions, but I'll tell everybody online to just hit that ask a question button and ask what's on their minds as we get into these. Andrew Morris asks, how did people react to being interviewed for a book about being weird?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Andrew. Also, hi. So I would say that, I told everyone that I interviewed that it was about people who are different. I didn't always use the word weird because some people have really negative reactions to that. Ultimately, they all knew the title before the book was published, of course. I personally, in the book, I explain how I see it as a positive thing, and I see it as like almost like a reclamation of being weird. So I did not have many qualms about kind of describing these folks as weird because I mean it in such a complimentary way. And luckily, they were all game with it as well. If this is news to any of my interviewees, then I apologize.
This next question is from Brianne. They ask, is nonconformity inherent in personality, or can you cultivate your own weirdness?
Ooh, that's a really great question. I don't know. I was just thinking today that I didn't really examine whether people can cultivate nonconformity. I think it depends on like what situation you're in and what exactly you're trying to cultivate. There is part of the book that talks about how you can change your personality. So if you're super introverted, you can become more extroverted. One part of personality that might have to do with nonconformity is called openness to experience. And that's part of the big five. It's a major personality trait. It basically just means like how down for whatever you are. Like if someone's like, let's try bungee jumping, and you're always the person who's like, no way, that would mean that you're probably not very open to experience. I'm not just bungee jumping, but just random stuff, eating at new restaurants and things like that. So one way, there are ways to cultivate your openness to experience if that's a goal for you. But if you're surrounded by people who are also like that, and who are always like off on adventures and like being super crazy and weird, then it's not going to make you different compared to them. It's just going to make you like yet another weirdo and thus the same. So it kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But yeah, there are definitely ways to change your personality if you want to.
Absolutely. This next question is from Andrew again, but it's a really great one. I want to ask it.
Wow.
Based on your interviews, how aware of being weird are weird people?
Ooh. So, okay, I would say, so the people that I interviewed for the book, I would say like, if you just met them walking down the street, you wouldn't be like, that person's so weird, because they're weird because of their context, right? Like they're the only one doing whatever it is they're doing. Like they're, like Julia, the NASCAR driver, just looks like a regular, like, 20-something woman. Like, but when she's like all in her racing suit and is like surrounded by all these dudes, you're like, whoa. Yeah, I think like they all recognize that there's something about them that made them pursue something that everyone else of their identity didn't. So like, I think they like, Julia knows why there's not more women NASCAR drivers. The guy, Daniel, who's a male preschool teacher, like understands why more people didn't pursue that path, who are men. So I think they have an understanding that they are different and they chose a different route, and they, or whatever, they had something inside themselves that made them pursue this kind of unusual life. But I don't think that they are like, they view themselves as like quirky necessarily, if that makes sense.
Totally. This next one is from Reed. They ask, were the people you interviewed more introverted or extroverted? Do you think that introversion or extroversion makes someone more or less likely to be weird?
Oh, good question. Okay, I think the people I talked to were mostly introverted for this one. Yeah, I don't know why. I think, which is interesting because they definitely picked a path that was like they were swimming upstream, right? Like they were surrounded by people different from them and had no natural network. But I wonder if that kind of makes sense because it wasn't a natural like friend making situation. If you're the only liberal in this super conservative town, it's going to be hard for you to like have a giant, brunch crowd that you can like banter with endlessly, because you're going to run into hot topics that you don't agree with each other about. So I think that for whatever reason, I got the sense that they were mostly introverts. I could be wrong. Like they didn't, but I do think that introversion correlates with weirdness. And I think that's something we're seeing now in the like quarantine era. I think that a lot of weirdos and a lot of people who have been like clicking like yes on my book have been like the people who are like enjoying social isolation.
Yeah, totally. That's surprising to me, but I guess it does. I mean, when you put it like that, it does kind of make sense that those people might be more introverted in their situation. So thanks, Reed, for that question. Yeah. This next one is from Molly. She asks, what was your biggest wow moment when researching this book?
I got to say that study about women in their first trimester, pregnant women in their first trimester being more xenophobic because they're more prone to infection. Like, that's so trippy to me. Like, it's so weird how our bodies like decide to keep us safe in these totally counterproductive ways. Like, if you like our I don't know, I feel like our brains are like these overprotective parents and like are constantly trying to like make us safer, but in the process like completely screwing us over and making us like not function well in the world. Like, I don't know, as someone who like struggles with anxiety, I feel like I'm always like, why is my brain like telling me to wake up at 3 a.m. and worry about random stuff? And like, I feel like that's like another example, the behavioral immune system of our brains being like, worry about people who are different. And like, it doesn't make any sense. So that was probably the most surprising thing to me.
Absolutely. It's trippy is the word.
Yes.
Definitely. Claire asks, are there any literary or book characters that you think are emblematic of what's weird? I guess, do any come to
yeah, I not in the book, like I don't profile any, all the people I profile are like alive and well. But I'm trying to think. Yeah, I feel like so first of all, a lot of like poets and like writers, I feel like are these like reclusive kind of sort of people who would definitely qualify as weird. I just read that book about Harper Lee and the murder that she tried to write about, and I'm blanking on the name right now. But it's by the New Yorker writer. I'll think of it as soon as I hang up from this thing. But it's a very good book. Yeah. And I feel like Harper Lee really meets the definition of weird. Like, she seemed to completely like withdraw into her own little world, and she seemed to like kind of not really have friends and like sort of have trouble connecting with people and like sort of be like this total recluse. But at the same time, she wrote one of the greatest novels ever. And so I think you see that a lot with a lot of other writers who are they're not going to be like president of the homeowners association. They're like all like kind of just like freaks and geeks.
Love it. And that book is Furious Hours by Casey Sepp.
I wanted to say Sound and the Fury, and then I'm like, no, that's something else.
Close though, close.
Yes.
Tom asks, how does people's definition of weird differ depending on their age?
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So like what would be weird for some people is not weird for other people. I think that's going to fall right back into cultural tightness and looseness, because really age is like a generation, right? So like several generations ago, gay marriage was much less common, so it might have been thought of as like unusual. But now I feel like people in my generation, it would almost be frowned upon to say that, just because it's so common and so accepted now. So I think essentially the vector is like time, and with time, society has gotten looser, and because of that, fewer things are now considered weird. But that's just a conjecture. I'm sure that there are a ton of like old hippies out there who are just down for whatever.
True. So Stephanie asks, did researching and writing the book recontextualize parts of your life or your past?
Yes. This has like not been a super satisfying answer for people when they ask me this, but I kind of started to think that I was not as weird as I maybe started out thinking, or maybe that I am just as weird as everyone else and everyone is kind of weird. Like I had this like very kumbaya moment toward the end where I was like, we are all one and we are all weird. Because I don't know, I like started like interviewing my parents more about Midland and kind of like learning more about the culture there and the culture of Texas in general, and doing all this traveling around and stuff. And I don't know, I kind of got very like this vibe that maybe we weren't so different from the people there after all. So in that way, it did recontextualize it a little bit. Yeah.
Cool. There is a question from Gerard posting on behalf of Layla or Lila. Lila asks, as a first-generation immigrant who's born in a tight culture, Iran, and grew up in a loose culture, the USA, I'm sorry, I probably should have read this a little bit before. Is your experience that most immigrants who experience cultural transitions feel weird and try to align and unify their kind of immigrant experiences? Do you think weirdness or trying to conform is more prevalent in immigrant cultures, I guess?
That's so interesting. Oh, hi, Layla. Thank you for writing in. Sorry, Layla is a friend of mine.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I would say as a science writer that my sample size was not big enough to speak on behalf of all immigrants. I totally know what you're saying. It's like, do people tend to, do immigrants who are first generation like me, do they tend to try to conform, or do they tend to like stick with other immigrants, or like stay more true to their culture? And I think it totally depends on the context. I feel like I had no choice. There was no way I could stay true to my culture of being Russian, right? Like there were no other Russians in Midland, and I was not going to like be this like lonely floating balloon for the rest of my life. So I had to adopt some Texan like openness to being like somewhat Texan. But at the same time, I've met some Russians who grew up in like LA or just or like Miami, and like they just had more Russians around, and they had more of that influence. And I feel like they were able to stay more true to their like home culture because of that. And I like, which was like always my parents' like greatest desire, that I like become more Russian. But I just don't think there was like a way for me to do it. Like it wasn't just not possible. But I think it is possible for some people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Stephanie has another question that I really like. She asked, how did you find the people to interview?
Yeah. So I've been working on this for 5 years, and I kind of started out as soon as I decided that I wanted it to be about people who were different from everyone else. I started just researching things that were completely homogenous. So like jobs, areas, towns, like groups, things that were like, everyone here is the same. And then finding like the one person there who was different. Mm-hmm. So like, I would like go through and comb through social media looking for like male preschool teachers, or like I would, I'm sorry, that sounds really creepy, but that's honestly how journalists do their job. I'm sorry. No, awesome. But yes, that is how.
Sausage gets made or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'll take another. Unfortunately, don't have enough time to get to all of the audience questions, but I did want to read this one from Marguerite because it has a really lovely compliment in it. Marguerite says, your writing in The Atlantic is fantastic. Whoops, I lost it. It bumped up. Is there a common thread or element to the topics you write about? How did you end up in a position to be able to write on such a wide variety of topics that always have an interesting angle, rather than be a more narrow health or foreign policy reporter? I know it's not about the book, but I thought it was a really lovely question.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so totally like 80% of that praise goes to my bosses at The Atlantic, who just are like machines for turning like my random thought sprays into like interesting ideas or articles. And like I mean, I just think it's like the kind of place where people go to like really write those big ideas and like explore big questions, and to write things that people will be interested in. Like I don't know, I like as soon as I got there and I realized that was like the whole mission, it was like such a great feeling, because that's always what I wanted to do. I don't know, I've just always been like obsessed with human nature and human behavior. And I think probably because I never had any friends, I was always thinking about why people do what they do. And so now to be able to like actually professionally be obsessed with that has been awesome. Like I just I'm so grateful, and that's really it. Like I'm like obsessed with stuff, and my job capitalizes on those obsessions.
That is so cool, and a great answer to that question, I think. Well, so we're running a little bit low on time, but I do want to make sure and ask. We, as a bookstore, we're kind of supplying people with, what they need to get them through this really odd time, and we're wondering what our authors are turning to as reading material during these days. So what are you reading right now, Olga?
Yeah, all day long I read news updates about the coronavirus, and then at night I've been trying to read more novels. I'm reading On Edge by Andrea Peterson, which is about anxiety, which is topical in a way right now. And I've also been reading Normal People Like Everyone Else by Sally Rooney, I think, right? Which is just like so great and lovely and like a great breath of fresh air after you've been like crushing on coronavirus news all day.
Totally. It is such a good one. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Olga, for this really awesome talk. I would suggest that anybody with an unanswered question that I'm so sorry we couldn't get to, go check out the book on PNP's website. Go ahead and get Weird by Olga Khazan. We just thank everybody for being here, especially you, Olga.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for tuning in and asking such great questions. And you can also like DM me on Twitter or whatever, like email me and I'll try to answer everyone else's questions.
Awesome. Love that. So yeah, your patronage is what's letting us bring you this programming, and we really, we're depending on it to be able to host these kinds of events. You can follow Politics and Prose on Crowdcast by hitting our logo up at the top of your screen. We've got some great events coming down the pipeline, so we hope that you tune in, and we see you next time. So stay well and stay well read, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye, Olga.
Bye.